So at this point, I'd like to turn it over to our director, Dr. Bob Proussel, to give some opening remarks and also to welcome our speaker.
Thank you so much, Leah. I'd like to welcome everyone to this wonderful curator's talk regarding our brand new exhibition, A Verry Drunk Hunters Dream, Modernist Expression in Africa. The exhibit opened up just about a month ago, September 15th, and it represents our return from COVID. So I'm very pleased to see all of you here present and enjoying this exhibit and the reception. I want to begin with Brown University's land acknowledgement. Brown University is located in Providence, Rhode Island, on lands that are within the ancestral homelands of the Narragansett Indian tribe. We acknowledge that beginning with colonization and continuing for centuries, the Narragansett Indian tribe has been dispossessed of most of their ancestral lands in Rhode Island by the actions of individuals and institutions. We acknowledge our responsibility to understand and respond to those actions. The Narragansett Indian tribe, whose ancestors stewarded these lands with great care, continues as a sovereign nation today. We commit to working together to honor our past and build our future with truth. As a member of the committee that developed this statement, I want to remind you of the ways that you can help raise the visibility of Native American issues both nationally and here in New England. And the place to start on campus is with NACI, the Native American and Indigenous Studies Initiative, which is led by Ray Gould, its executive director. Ray can help put you in touch with our Native students and faculty and brief you on our Native programming. It is now my great pleasure to introduce Bolaji Campbell. Bolaji is professor of African and African Diaspora art in the Department of Theory and History of Art and Design at RISD, and a practicing artist himself. Bolaji holds a PhD in art history from the University of Wisconsin-Madison and an MFA from Obafemi Awolowo University in Ile-Ife, Nigeria. He is a recipient of numerous honors and awards, including the Sylvia and Pamela Coleman Fellowship at the Metropolitan Museum of Art, the Richard A. Horowitz Professional Development Fund Fellowship from the Institute of International Education, and a postdoctoral fellowship at the Avery Research Center for African American History and Culture. His many publications include Fabric of Immortality, Ancestral Power, Performance, and Agency in Egungun Artistry, published in 2019, and Painting for the Gods, Art and Aesthetics of Yoruba Religious Murals, published in 2007. Bolaji co-curated this exhibition with Terry Gentis, the head curator of the Haffenreffer Museum of Anthropology, and the students in Bolaji's class, who I'll read out: Miriam Bakare, Annabelle Burgum, John Bryant, Jack English, Karen Fan, Emma Fuenchila, Carter Hyatt, Andrew Katz, and Lee Siu. The exhibit is testimony to the close connections between RISD and Brown, which include a number of collaborative projects and exhibitions, most recently one called Whirling Return of the Ancestors, Ngungun Masquerade Ensembles of the Yoruba, which opened at RISD in 2016. The current exhibition presents a vibrant tapestry of West African artistic expressions that transcends time and space. It presents paintings by a group of modernist Ghanaian and Nigerian artists, Richmond Akam, Anne Blankston Hemmons, Otto Delaki, Ablade Glover, Asiru Olatudene, Kwe Odin, Larry Otu, Twin 77, and Suzanne Wegner. These artists defied the strictures of colonial rule and developed a distinctive visual vocabulary cognizant of their cultural and historical past and generative of new futures. The curators have chosen to place their works in dialogue with printed and woven textiles, wooden and metal sculpture, royal paraphernalia, plastic dolls, and a fantasy coffin. This juxtaposition breaks down the boundaries between art and anthropology and highlights continuities and differences in West African culture and society. Please join me in welcoming Bolaji.
Thank you, Bob. And thank you so much, my distinguished colleagues and friends who are here, who have been speaking to myself here without your presence, and I really appreciate that you could, create the time out of no time, out of your busy schedule to be here to join me in all of this. I truly appreciate it. So navigating the mysterious and the exotic is more or less, a little bit of an insight into some of the issues that I was dealing with as we contemplated putting all of this together. But perhaps I felt I needed to start from the very title itself, A Very Drunk Hunter's Dream. And I'm going to begin in the Yoruba tradition by looking at some of Yoruba narratives, some of Yoruba folk stories, because that is the theoretical basis to which to ground the very idea of a very drunk hunter's dream. There are several variations of Yoruba creation myths. The first holds that Obatala, the deity of creation, was given the task of creating the world by Olodumare, the author of existence. Obatala descended from the outer realm into the material world in order to create the landmass from primordial waters. Obatala was provided with the mythical implements of creation in the form of a closed calabash known as Igbaiwa, within which was a snail shell containing the primeval soil, a 5-toed chicken, some palm kernel nuts, and a chameleon. Obatala descended on top of a palm tree, Eshu, the deity of chance, ambivalence, and uncertainty, subsequently directed Obatala's attention to the juices of palm wine on top of the palm tree. Obatala soon succumbed to the inebriating influences of the sweet juices, drinking excessively, falling into slumber, and totally forgetting about the important assignments he had been given by Olodumare. Oduduwa, another deity, along with several others, approached Olodumare, desirous to know what had become of Obatala. But they soon Oduduwa approached Olodumare to investigate. Oduduwa and his party were sent to the material world to go and inquire of what had become of Obatala, but they found him on top of the palm tree. He was in total slumber, which had resulted from the drinking stupor. So Oduduwa landed with the head of a chain, collected the deed of creation from Obatala, and he soon poured the primeval soil on the surfaces of the water and released the chicken. And the chicken scattered the soil, and the place where that mysterious event took place is the very epicenter of Yoruba universe known as Ile-Ife. The land expands. That is the center of Yoruba civilization. But there's another version of the creation myth. Olodumare commissioned Obatala with the task of creating the universe with its human and animal inhabitants. Obatala successfully completed the first phase of the assignment, which was the creation of the landmass. The second phase, he was required to mold the physical forms of humans. However, in his exhilaration at the completion of the first part of the assignment, he decided to relax by refreshing himself with some beverages. Eshu again, the deity of chance, directed Obatala's attention to a keg of palm wine. Obatala drank his fill and continued his task with consummate vigor. Not surprisingly, Obatala began creating misfits. the albino, the hunchback, the lame, and all peoples with physical challenges are regarded as the byproducts of Obatala's inebriation. Because of the peculiarity of their situation, people with physical deformities are regarded as special children or special creation of Obatala. Hence, they are called Eni Orisha, bequests of the Orisha. It is believed that their distinguishing features constitute the special mark of the Orisha on them. Indeed, it is assumed that Obatala specifically placed those marks on them as a means of setting them aside for his service. Hence, Yorubas say, we bestow the honor due the Orisha on the albino, or Orisha. Therefore, people with physical challenges are sometimes required to perform special functions in Yoruba society. They sometimes act as ritual specialists or attendants in shrines dedicated to the veneration of the Orisha. In the two versions of these creation myths, we have metaphors about human weaknesses, exemplified in the metaphor of drunkenness and its connection with failure conceptualized as the inability to complete assigned tasks. They also engage with human susceptibilities and the need for caution in all aspects of human endeavor. There are so many variations of the metaphor of drunkenness and weaknesses in several aspects of Yoruba cultural landscape. The goal is to teach about unpredictability and the frailty of human aspirations and weaknesses. The creation of physical deformities and misfits is to underscore the need to always go beyond surface appearances and concentrate on the essential nature of people and things. By essential nature, Yoruba categorize this as Iwa, character. And for Yoruba people, Iwalewa, character is beauty. Character is of the essence. Everything in creation have their own distinct or peculiar attributes and unique identities that should be nurtured, celebrated, and honored. Susan Wenger and Blankson Hammonds and Twin 77 have deliberately drawn our attention to these attributes in their unique interpretations of the metaphor of drunkenness, procurement of the sweet juices of palm wine, and the resultant fantasies of boundless possibilities and unfettered opportunities offered in the consumption of the palm wine. The modernist scene in the second half of the 20th century in Ghana and Nigeria mirrored precisely these possibilities, the boundlessness and indeterminacy of creative imagination. But how does one begin to engage with contemporary African arts in the 21st century? Which analytical tools can one deploy in dealing with its complex, multifaceted elements? Its analytical features defy all known and recognizable art historical permutations of visual analysis. Yet, the questions to ponder are, has contemporary African art adapted to the taste of the 21st century? And if so, in what ways has it succumbed to the allure of pastiche, postmodernism, hydra-headed undercurrents? Although it may exhibit or show discernible patterns or awareness of the latest trends in Western industrial capitals, nevertheless, its yearnings and aspirations are decidedly different from the concerns of post-industrial Western democracies' anxieties over hyperinflation. Without a doubt, the focus has shifted. Contemporary African art has come of age. Gone are those romantic fixations on negative philosophy and anti-colonial rhetoric of decolonization, including dismantling colonial structures of inferiority and power. The most topical issues of today are different. Although the thematic preoccupation of the heart distantly echoes hints of post-colonial and to a certain extent post-apartheid ripples of the mid-70s, nevertheless, today's art covers a broad spectrum of human experience, including deliberate disruption of the Western canon, ambivalence and marginalization in the wake of erasure of African contribution to the modern world, There is also the lack of visibility for peoples of African descent within the high fashion and advertising industry. Others are environmental pollution, like oil spillage, dramatic changes in the weather, droughts, mass migration, consumerism, economic survival, healthcare delivery, women and infant mortality, religious persecution, insect and rape, genital mutilation, xenophobia, and racial violence are among a few of the nagging issues at the very core of the immediate concern of contemporary African artists of the modern era. From this, it is crystal clear that the art is definitely beyond the identity politics of post-apartheid era. At some level, the field has recently generated a renewed interest and awareness in the shifting terrain of mass culture and consumerism, parody and otherness, ambivalence and late capitalism espoused in the work of Yinka Shonibare, for instance, and a legion of other artists using the Africanized Dutch wax prints, Ankara, the fabric, on the backs of the mannequins here are known as Ankara in much of West Africa. Yet, few of the artists who use this fabric actually understood its inherent contradictions. It is entirely a misnomer to refer to the fabric as African, when in fact it was about the commodification of Indonesian cultural patrimony. It is incontestable to assert that the Dutch appropriated the technology from the Javanese and sold the commodity to Africans, thereby creating a pseudo-African identity in the age of high consumerism. It was precisely the same ambivalent strategy used in fostering a regime of violence on the continent and its people by colonial exploitation and cultural conquest. But the Africanized Dutch fabric is a poignant reflection of the complex world we live in, an eloquent testament to the interconnected nature of people's goods and ideas from the late 19th century to the dawn of the 21st century. The Dutch wax print is an important commodity that codified the very nature and flow of consumerism and its inextricable connection with exploitative modernity from the industrialized North to the global South. And it was colonial, aberrant, violent, seductive, yet complicated. Let me digress a little by examining the mysterious and the exotic in a Verry Drunk Hunters Dream. I begin with fantasy coffins. Fantasy coffins have a very peculiar and intriguing origin. According to members of Kenikwe Workshop, the first coffin was originally inspired by the shape of a palanquin, typically used in conveying a newly installed chief in ritual procession around the community. The legendary late cabinet maker transformed the shape of the palanquin and adapted its form and function to honor the recently deceased matriarch in his lineage. It is fascinating that the very first fantasy coffin was made in the shape of an aircraft, an intriguing object that the deceased woman yearned throughout her life to travel in. While this dream was not immediately realizable during her mortal existence, Kenikwe provided her with a surrogate, an escapist fantasy, capable of conveying her in grand style to the land of the ancestors. And so a new genre of contemporary African art began. Everyone wanted a piece. Both local patrons as well as foreign aficionados of the spectacular commodity demanded one, and the possibilities are endless. The imagery and motifs included the cocoa pod, corn cob, pineapple, watermelon, Mercedes-Benz car, Nike sneakers, birds, a lion, a rocket, several varieties of fish, like, our own very own, sawfish, and a lobster, a family of chickens, a lonely rooster, an egg, a soccer ball, a loaf of bread, a pack of cigarettes, even a humongous phallus. For the foreign patrons, the intent was not to use the object for burial, As ridiculous as this may sound, some collectors in LA, Los Angeles area kept them in their living rooms purposely to take a nap in them. To the uncanny, it was simply a collectible item to be admired in a strangely curious, morbid way. In whichever dimension or perspective we subscribe to, this spectacular object might have just reaffirmed its ubiquitous entry into the realm of high art in the exalted vaults and display cases of Western art museums and galleries. I turn to the second scenario. Here, I address Ashiru Olatunde. Ashiru's intriguing composition in aluminum repoussé depicts a scene of two hunters and 4 animals in a thickly decorated foliage of a tree. The episodic scene is almost visceral, recreation of D.O. Fagunwa's classic novel, Ogboju Ode Ninu Igbo Irumole, subsequently translated as A Forest of 1,000 Demons by the Nobel laureate Wole Soyinka. In a fascinating scene of the hunts made entirely in a bilateral symmetry, we have the branches and buttresses of the tree. We have 2 long-nosed bush pigs and 2 rams facing each other. Each equally worthy of note is that the design of the tree looks very much like a transplant of the rivers Niger and Benue that divides Nigeria in the geographical map of Nigeria. And on either side of the composition, we have 2 hunters with their guns ready to pounce at the game hiding in the flowery foliage. Ashirus paid close attention to details in the piece. And in the same manner as Oshun ritual found in the collection in the museum, every little inch of the intriguing composition was carefully delineated. The flowery pattern leaves and the textural qualities of the tree buttresses have been carefully and robustly articulated. According to Ulibaya, Ashiru's creative repertoire, including fighting elephants, fighting leopards in the belly of a cow, or a hunter with a gun in the belly of an elephant. The possibilities are endless. Next, I move similarly to a well-crafted palm wine tapa by the legendary twin 77. Almost in a kind of idiosyncratic manner, it appears the expressive composition was inspired by Yoruba folk narratives of the same ubiquitous beverage, which is encountered at every stage of the sacred and secular life of Yoruba peoples. Here, Twin 77 recreates a scene depicting the palm wine tapa being heralded back from the farm by a group of hawkers following the harvesting of the sweet liquid from the tree. Equally prominent in the composition is the presence of the palm wine seller with a variety of kegs in her possession. The scene is warm, vibrant, and festive. But by far the most fascinating of all is the centerpiece of the exhibition, A Very Drunk Hunter's Dream by Susan Wenger. In a fantasy dream-like narrative, Suzanne takes us on a journey navigating the complex, surreal, imaginative vision of a hunter of elephants, Odeakweri, and his chance encounter with these larger-than-life animals. The hunter is accompanied by drummers who are with the hovering presence of our mothers, the mythical birds of the night in the sky. The fantasy journey ends tragically with the unfortunate killing of the elephant, but it also produces the birthing of new life. We cannot take all these images or narratives on face value. They are representations of deeper metaphors of life and how we carefully navigate our passage in this complicated terrain we call the material world. So, back to the nagging question posed in the beginning. How do we display African arts? Which analytical tools can one employ? A large majority of exhibition texts accompanying the display of many African art objects are sometimes produced from information gleaned primarily from published materials that contain in certain contexts inadequate, false, or downrightly misleading information. The situation is further worsened as most researchers tend to accord these published materials an aura of authenticity, largely because they are already in print. About 25 years ago, it took a great deal of effort on my part to persuade the curator of a special exhibition at a major museum in New York City to effect changes to some of the corrections that I suggested for the text and primary materials created to accompany an important exhibition on Yoruba culture. On several occasions where the programming was being developed, the curator would cite the defective, problematic information written, no doubt, by some of the leading experts in the discipline. A case in point was the praise name of a famous 20th century Yoruba wood carver, or Jarinde Owojobi, also known as Adigbologe. That's the first one. But this had been Adigbologe is translated as one who collides with a beautiful girl, a beautiful spinster. It's just his alias. But the erroneous entry and interpretation of his name was Adugbologe. The neighborhood is a beautiful spinster. Simple and petty as it might appear, the substitution and exchange of the consonants I and U in the name has substantially altered the intended import and meaning of the name. This is an error one cannot continue to ignore or simply sweep under the carpet. Each time the issue was addressed, I almost had to be apologetic while reminding the curator that first and foremost, I grew up in that culture and that I was also a native speaker of the language, and that much of what was contained in the material she had cited was wrong and simply misleading. Valuable time and effort that could have been spent on other important aspects of the presentation was devoted to resolving the tension and difficulty generated in the wake of much diplomatic maneuvering and negotiation. Unfortunately, the name Adugbologe still persists in scholarly literature on wooden sculptures from this important atelier in Nigeria. But barely 7 years after that unfortunate incident, I experienced a somewhat ridiculous but no less similar treatments, this time in the hand of an exhibition designer. I was asked to create a shrine installation and painting as part of a traveling exhibit which opened at the Society of African Missions Museum of African Arts in New Jersey. While working on the display cabinet, I suggested to the exhibition installer that we needn't give the cabinet a final or second coat of paint because it had a tendency of making the display too artificial, overly glossy and cosmetic, and far removed from the aura and attitude of reverence needed in a Yoruba shrine setting. But hardly was I out of earshot when this installer began to negotiate with other consultants on the project, wondering whether they needed to accept my suggestion, given the fact that he thought the display cabinet needed a second and perhaps a third layer of paint. His attitude was couched in much arrogance and clearly informed by an air of superiority rooted in ethnocentric biases, without any regard for cultural sensitivity in the presentation of other cultures. I am convinced that this individual had never seen or encountered a Yoruba shrine, let alone observe the processes and complexities of Orisha painting. Obviously, his greatest asset and credential lies at best in the fact that he was a good house painter. Indeed, he went on to sarcastically suggest that perhaps the next time he encountered a Yoruba house painter who was not very proficient, he would be more understanding, as if this was his privilege to confer, given the fact that he thought that's not presenting or creating a sleek house painting job was more of an incompetence conditioned by cultural and aesthetic preference of the Yorubas. But let me conclude here by asking yet another set of rhetorical questions, just in the same manner in which I began. How does one display African art objects? Do we organize them or assemble them on the basis of materiality or simply because of their thematic interest, age, or commercial value? Will you place a metal sculpture whose manufacture, use, and symbolism remains the exclusive preserve of elderly male members of society, with a wooden doll mostly used by pre-adolescent girls in the same society, in the same display cabinets because the both emanated from the same ethnic group or culture? Or would you perhaps display this subject together on the basis of their sacred or shared affinity as figural sculptures in the nude? What would your attitude or concern be if you realize that the metal object cannot be seen by non-initiates? That's the object to the left of the screen. Talk less of being displayed in the same platform as mere toy and a plaything, which is the one on the right. What about the ritual staff of Yoruba diviner that should always be placed on a vertical orientation, almost in the same way as these, linguist staffs? Yet, the best angle to place it inside the display cabinet will be on its side. Each time I see a divination board hung on the wall instead of appropriately being placed on a slightly raised platform to be admired for the sheer beauty of the deeply ingrained decorative elements, I laugh at the ridiculous and naive insensitivity of the curator. We should also consider the predicament of the ubiquitous mask. There are certainly more to a masquerade ensemble than just the wooden elements of the mask, which continues to be the focal point of attention in the display and presentation of this fascinating artistry in the West. Needless to state that masking is a multi-sensorial complex tradition involving religious beliefs, philosophical ethos, social practices, musical and theatrical performances. It is therefore inadequate to focus only on the little mask in the ensemble without paying equal attention to the form and the intrigue as an important aspect of this intriguing artistry. Without its performative and spiritual dimension, the mask is nothing but a worthless piece of wood, no better than a mere doll. In order to do adequate justice to its presentation, one must be ready to include not just the wooden elements, but also must be prepared to display the entire costume along with its desperate attachment, including music and sound, which of necessity accompany the public performances and presentation of the fascinating artistry. In this manner, we might attempt to capture a tiny aspect of its evocative and multi-layer elements. The same could also be said of the predicament of the highly venerated bronze heads from Benin, which are typically placed on sacred altars in their cultural setting, but are now being displayed in a few museums in this country as ordinary commonplace household items like baskets and spoons. This was the predicament of the Benin pieces in the Rhode Museum. But thankfully, these are now gradually inching their way back to Nigeria, to the Royal, Museum in Benin. But how does one grapple with all these perplexing scenarios in the face of professional and ethical responsibility? The questions to ask is, how did the objects function in their cultural settings? How were they displayed? Another equally important issue is the type of illumination and lighting used in showcasing African art objects. Objects that are never used in daylight or in the open should not be intensely spotlighted within the gallery space. Dim lighting or subtle illumination on the object will be a mark of respect for the cultural traditions that produce them. And those objects with strict gender restriction should not be put on display at all. But let me end by stating the obvious, that we live in a fast-paced world driven and controlled by the economic might of the first world nations, where the ownership of the world's most sacred treasures are seen as the exclusive prerogative of the rich and powerful industrial Western powers, without any consideration for the historical, moral, and sometimes religious ethos of the people, of the owners and the creators of the objects in the first instance. There is a need to adopt a much more sensitive and pacifying attitude in the display and presentation of African art. As Roy Sieber correctly advocated, familiarity breeds understanding. And that same understanding breeds acceptance. And it is that understanding which engenders deeper appreciation and sensitivity. As simple as this might appear, it remains the veritable touchstone in any fruitful and nuanced engagement in the display and presentation of African art today. I cannot conclude this address without expressing my profound gratitude first to Bob, Professor Robert Purcell, director of the Haffenreffer Museum, for extending an invitation not only to speak today in this forum in connection with a Verry Drunk Hunters Dream, but perhaps more importantly to serve as a guest co-curator together with Terry Gentis in the presentation of a selection of Haffenreffen's unique collection of modern African art in the museum. I gratefully acknowledge the entire curatorial team, especially the superb and sensitive manner the exhibition was presented, despite the challenges posed by the conservation of some of the pieces in the exhibition. It was indeed a pleasure working with all of the amazing staff, and last but not the least, to the attentive audience, I say a big thank you. I'll be happy to take a few questions. Fortunately, I don't have the palm wine today. I had the palm wine at the opening. I would have said, let's drink.
But you never poured for us either.
I did the last time.
Okay.
I did the last time. That was the very first token to acknowledge issue. But not today. I paid respects by acknowledging, the ambivalence in the creation myth.
So your technology worked today.
It did, perfectly so, and thank you to Leah too.
Bolaji, I was just wondering, I know very little about African and but I teach Chinese art. So I also when I go to museums, I wonder about like how things are installed and what it means. So is this and obviously we have a lot of issues with Native American art, etc. So is this a general issue, or do you feel that this is a more specific issue that is related to African art, about installation and sensitivity?
I would be naive to say that it's only peculiar to African. It is not. I'm sure with Native American or Mexican art or even Chinese art, there are a little bit of inconsistencies in the way in which they are displayed. Some of these objects are used within the context of rituals. They were never intended originally, to function as items to be put on display. So that creates some certain level of ambiguities about them, When we collect them in the West, the intent is to display, right? Is to create spectacle around the objects. But a few of these objects are deeply rooted in ritual, in religious traditions, and by putting them on display, it creates a level of absurdity, in the way in which native culture bearer reacts to them. Let me go back for a minute to the piece on the left there. Typically, that item, the Onile piece, is supposed to be buried within the meeting house of the elders, male and female, who meet to deliberate on important issues in the society. It's not a piece to be admired. It's a piece that is often buried. It becomes the very epicenter of their meeting. And what I find particularly intriguing about the Onile piece, discovered in a Virginia plantation here in this country, was an image of a male figure, a metal piece, also buried in the ground in a smithery, in the smith workshop. It's an acknowledgement of the presence of the ancestor. It's supposed to function where? In the ground. Because periodically, Gino reminded me of pouring libation of wine. We pour palm wine there to feed the ancestor because it is a votive symbol of the presence of the ancestor. So it's not an item that should be displayed. It's an item that should receive libation in the ground. So, but this is where the tension lies. We cannot display it in a gallery or a museum, right? There's no how we can create that ambience of reverence or, transform the item into something that should be worshipped. It's not going to be possible. But so how do you navigate that? We can display it to creating the illusion of being buried. We'll do some justice to it. If we create, a transparent container with maybe some dirt in it, and people can then see it within the context within which it functions, then it comes alive. It's much more respectful that way than simply putting it on display. It's an item that shouldn't be seen by people who are not initiated into the cult of Ogboni, for instance. So this is part of the challenge. Whereas we can very easily put it on display there, right next to a doll. A doll which a child will carry, right? And use as a surrogate and pretend that, they're taking care of babies. But it also functions in the way in which it teaches us how children are being prepared for adulthood, right? So that they can nurture that maternal instincts. But they don't belong in the same context. That's what the issue is. Did I answer your question, Paula?
I totally agree. The thing that I feel like the disconnect is mostly between our modern world and the traditional world, because probably, I don't know, but probably even in Africa there is like maybe a way of looking at these things from a point of view of aesthetic, I don't know. So museums really, they're coming from another world, right? They never come from, they try, but they never try, or they're unable to complete. And so, as an Italian, for instance, when I came from Italy, most of the painting that I saw were in churches. So then I come here and they're all in museums.
Exactly.
Are all the Virgin Mary's doing here.
Yeah.
So you just like start to think, and then you come to the realization that, it's a museum, so they're doing something different.
Exactly.
Right?
Exactly.
And so the question is it our modern world that it's looking at things that are traditional in a way that is fundamentally different from the past?
Yes, in a way, I could say that comfortably, how the museum developed, right? They are more or less byproduct of industrialization when people needed, to display industrial goods, right? To begin to market the goods. And that became, the original incentive, to collect items from overseas travels and display them, right? So there's that mercantilist, commodification of cultures and, also linked, all right, to economic, opportunities and adventurism. which are all byproducts, of modernist era and of industrialization. But in the process, have we been sensitive, to the yearnings of peoples? I mean, fascinating example you gave of, the paintings that you encounter only within the, within the sanctuary, within the sacred space of the church.
There are, of course, paintings, religious paintings in museums in Italy, but mostly I associate, particularly the avatars in the big office, you associate with the church.
Exactly. So there's an aura of reverence, around them. But we demystify everything by putting them on display in sacred institutions, right? And the intent is to bring in the crowd, bring in the people, right? And they pay a token to see. Whereas within the context of the church, you don't pay anything. In the shrines where some of these items are based, in Yoruba land or elsewhere, nobody pays to go there. You only pay, to imbibe a little bit of the spiritual presence, right? In that very location, that very place, in order for you to make that needed connection, right? So it's a religious experience, far removed from the commercial intent and the spectacle created, in the museums. I don't know where we're going with the museums. Maybe in the next century, we might even forget about them, because it appears a new trend has started by repatriating, some of the pieces back to Nigeria, for instance, and I know the Greeks will follow. There are so many other cultures that are pressuring, the British Museum to release some of the pieces that have been collected all over the world. I don't know. I'm not a shaman, I'm not a babalawo, but I can tell, we're moving in a fast-paced world, and attitudes are changing, all right? Yes, Lindsay?
Can you talk a little more about the paintings on the other side of the wall?
On the other side?
Just because what you've presented, on the other side of the
I know. I was more interested in, presenting part of the exotic. But some of the most important are also in this part of, the gallery. I've equally written extensively on Glover's work, particularly, the market as an important metaphor, as an important aspect of, the modernist development in Africa. How the market was so central, right, as a meeting place of peoples and goods. How significant it is that it became, the nexus of interaction between the West and Africa. And the market is actually controlled by women. And they define, all right, the tempo and the tenor of the market space. Ablade Glover captures that. He calls it a kind of basa-basa aesthetics, that it is in flux. You cannot, what he does is he more or less immobilizes a moment in time, but he reminds us that it's always constantly on the move. And it's so, emblematic of the world in which we live. It's fraught with a lot of changes. And it is the propelling force, what stimulates him in creating the paintings of the market space. And equally related to that is, his focus on the beauty of the African woman, right? Our mother. And I see the painting, of the African woman there representing, modernist Africa, all right? It's the beauty and elegance of the modern African woman, but at the same time, they are the formidable force all right, occupying that crossroads in the interaction and the tension between Europeans and Africans. Long before, in pre-colonial African society, women held sway. They held a lot of power. Some were rulers in their kingdoms. But the British colonialists in Ghana and Nigeria changed all that because they were not comfortable dealing with African women. And this led to a lot of tension. It created Aba riots, it also created riots in Abeokuta where the ruler was chased out of the palace and he had to go into exile because he aligned with the British colonial, authorities. But the women reacted, and the leader of the women who reacted was Fela Ransom Kuti's mother, who chased the Alake out of his palace, and he went on exile. So, in a way, this part of of the gallery is equally fascinating, is stimulating, but maybe not as mysterious as the fantasy coffin, or perhaps as the hunter's dream of Suzanne. Or Anne's, image of the drunken guy standing, watching and waiting for the rapid transformation in Ghana of the 80s in particular. Any more? Well, thank you so much. Please, let's have some more food. Thank you.